Hello YouTube! So I wanted to revisit one of my more controversial videos. A little over a year ago I uploaded a video in which I argued that there are true contradictions. Or, more precisely, what I argue is that you can have true contradictions if you want them. So I'll link that original video in the comments so you can go and check that out. Yeah, I just wanted to address some of the objections to it. So basically the idea is this. What I say is, look, I'm just going to introduce this new term, and the term is Wulture. And the rules for how this term is used are as follows. The term Wulture applies to anything that is a vulture and to nothing else. And secondly, it fails to apply to anything that is white. So anything that's a vulture counts as a Wulture. Anything that is white fails to count as a Wulture. So now, right, suppose that Delia is a white vulture. Well, given the rules for the use of this term, Delia is a Wulture, and it is the case that Delia is not a Wulture. The term applies to Delia, and it fails to apply to her. So we have a contradiction. Delia is a Wulture, and Delia is not a Wulture, and it is not the case that Delia is a Wulture. So that's the basic idea. Now, I mean, there's lots of objections that people raise to this, but I think that probably the two most common ones were that. So one objection was that this term that I've introduced is actually just meaningless or unintelligible or incoherent or something like that. The second objection is that the term is perfectly consistent. It just implies a false empirical claim. It implies the claim that there are no white vultures, which we just know is false. So there's two very different objections that people have raised to this, right? So on the one hand, we have people saying, look, this is just completely meaningless and unintelligible. On the other hand, we have people saying, no, it's meaningful and actually it's totally consistent. There is no true contradiction here. So I want to address both of these objections. Obviously, there are other objections. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to address these two because they seem to be the two objections that people present most commonly. So okay, let's start with this first objection then, the idea that the term Wulture is unintelligible or meaningless. Now, of course, I mean, in response to a criticism that what I'm saying is meaningless, there is a kind of limit to what I can do with that, right? I mean, ultimately, it is always possible for somebody to just slam their fist on the table and say, nope, I just don't get it. But I think that, I mean, what's odd about this sort of case is it strikes me as just so sort of simple and obvious. I feel like a child could understand it. So, I mean, maybe, another way into this would be to think about a very simple sort of game, right? So let's say that I invite you to play the following game, which involves putting stickers on things. So the sticker game has the following rules, okay? Let's say, you walk into a room and the rule is, right, I've given you a set of stickers and the rule is, first, you've got to put a sticker on anything that is a vulture. And then secondly, you have to ensure that there is no sticker on anything that is white. Now, I think that game is totally easy to understand. You know exactly what you've got to do for most of the objects in the room, right? So most of the time you're going to see a vulture and you put a sticker on it, or you see something that's like a hat and you're like, well, I'm ensure there is no sticker on that. Now, of course, when you encounter a white vulture in the room, well, now you're going to be a little bit unsure, right? How do you deal with that? The rules of the game tell you to put a sticker on the white vulture, but they also tell you to ensure that there is no sticker on the white vulture. Now, that's perhaps a little bit baffling, that's perhaps annoying, but it's not unintelligible. I mean, we all understand that perfectly well, and we understand, like, when you face the white vulture and you feel that kind of bafflement about, oh, wait, what am I supposed to do with this? The reason why you're feeling that bafflement is precisely because you totally understand the rules of this game. So the point is that the word Wulture works exactly the same way. Now, I mean, look, of course, you could argue that, look, words and concepts can't work that way. I mean, maybe my attempt to stipulate these rules for the word Wulture fail for some reason. Maybe there are additional constraints on what can count as a genuine concept or a genuine language. But I don't think that there's a problem comprehending what's being said here, right? Like, even if I'm wrong, even if there are these additional constraints on what counts as a genuine language, I don't think the claim I'm making is just incomprehensible. So again, this sticker game is simple enough that a child could understand it, and the word Wulture works just like that game. And I mean, look, so certainly, again, the argument could be made that, okay, it's not a genuine word, or it's not part, it couldn't be part of a genuine language or something like that. I mean, maybe you could make that sort of argument, but the word Wulture is a word that can be, it's a sound, let's say, that can be used to communicate information. Judgments that we make using this sound can be straightforwardly right or wrong. So when I encounter a black vulture, such as Ron, okay, and I say Ron is a Wulture, well, that's just clearly true, right? It's like, yeah, the word Wulture just straightforwardly applies to Ron. On the other hand, when I encounter, a white hat, well, okay, yeah, the word Wulture straightforwardly fails to apply to that. So people can, in principle, use this language. They can use it to communicate information. They can come to sort of consensus judgments with this sort of term. And for the people using this language, the judgment that Delia, the white vulture, both is and is not a Wulture, that's going to be right. That's going to be the right judgment, just like our judgment that she is a vulture is right to us. So I mean, that's what I would say about this idea that the term is unintelligible. Again, I mean, ultimately, maybe somebody would just say, no, even the sticker game is completely unintelligible. But I don't know. That's what I'll say about that. Okay, so the second type of objection is that the term Wulture is not actually going to get you true contradictions, right? In fact, the language that I've described is a perfectly consistent language. It's just a language which ultimately presupposes a false empirical claim. So the way that this would work is this. So this rule that so I've said, look, there's two rules to this term Wulture. So first of all, it's going to apply to anything that is a vulture, and secondly, it's going to fail to apply to anything that is white. So what I'm saying then, like, one way to frame this is, if X is a vulture, then X is a Wulture. If X is a Wulture, then X is not white. But then, I mean, it's a fairly straightforward inference, right? Given transitivity, it's, okay, we're going to then infer, if X is a vulture, then X is not white, which is just to say that there are no white vultures. So this term Wulture, if we introduce that into our language, is going to presuppose that there are no white vultures. That's a false presupposition. So really, this is perfectly consistent. Right? It's not like there's true contradictions here. We're just making a false claim. Right? That's basically the idea. So first of all, I want to sort of draw an analogy to a similarly structured case. So this case of the term Wulture, it was pointed out to me. I didn't actually realize this when I first made the video, but it has a similar structure to an example that Graham Priest uses in the context of social contradictions. I do actually have another video on social contradictions. But so Priest points out that there are certain legal systems where it might be the case that you have certain rules that end up leading to contradictory legal rights. So he gives the example of a legal system where it's a rule that anybody that is a landowner has the right to vote, but that women do not have the right to vote. But then it turns out that due to certain legal loopholes, there are cases where women can become landowners. So essentially what we have here is there are going to be certain women where it's true that they have the right to vote, but it's also false that they have the right to vote, right? It's like they have the right to vote in virtue of being landowners, but they fail to have the right to vote in virtue of being women. That's the basic example. Now, similarly, we could say, we can sort of summarize this legal system as resting on, it sort of has these sort of two principles, right? Like if X is a landowner, then X has the right to vote. If X has the right to vote, then X is not a woman. Now, in this particular case, like, does that show that, like, in that society, in that system, has the right to vote presupposes that there are no women landowners? That doesn't seem quite right to me. Now, of course, in this case, we're talking about, legal rights rather than just, terms, right? Terms in our language. But I think that, one thing one thing I would say here is, like, words in themselves, I think it's at least not obvious, let's say, that words in themselves express propositions. Right? I mean, it seems like probably words in themselves don't express propositions. The words, at least the kind of word I'm talking about, applies or fails to apply to certain things. So when I have this word Wulture, the word Wulture doesn't express some set of propositions A and B, right? It doesn't express that, the proposition that if X is a vulture, then X is a vulture, or if X is a vulture, then X is not white. It's just, like what we're doing when we say those two conditionals is kind of summarizing in a propositional form the way in which the word is used. Now, of course, it might be said, look, if we include the word vulture into our language, then these are the inferences that we would make. So if we include the word vulture into our language, then we are going to make the inference that if X is a vulture, then X is a vulture. If X is a vulture, then X is not white. And from those, of course, we make the inference that if X is a vulture, then X is not white. But I think that, in response to that, I would just say, well, no, right? That's not the right inference, right? Like because here's the thing, we know that there are white vultures. So if we decide, knowing that there are white vultures, to include the term vulture into our language, then of course we shouldn't make the inference that if X is a vulture, then X is not white. Now, I mean, what I think would be the case is, like, well, if you choose to, model the use of the term with a certain type of formal logic or something like that, then maybe from that point of view, you would say that is the inference you ought to make or something. But from my point of view, I just, I would just say, well, that's like just a limit of, whatever formal logic we're using. I mean, essentially, the way I see it is, I've described a certain pattern of language use, okay? And it seems to me like there's nothing preventing us from talking this way, from thinking in this way. And part of what it is to talk in this way and to think in this way is that you don't make the inference that there are no white vultures, because we know that there are white vultures. So what you infer is, like, no, if there are white vultures, then those things are going to be both vultures and not vultures. And this is a stable sort of pattern of language use. It's a pattern of language that we can learn to play with and that we can teach to others perfectly easily, right? So to infer the claim from introducing the term vulture into our language, to infer that there are no white vultures, well, that's just not how you play this particular game. And again, you could always say, well, look, that's the inference that you ought to draw. But why, right? Why ought you do that? After all, that claim is false, right? We know that that's false. We know that there are white vultures. If the claim is supposed to be that, well, the proposition that there are no white vultures is what is entailed by this language, whether you like it or not, well, that's just going to be presupposing some sort of, logic as a kind of external constraint, which is not something I'm going to be getting on board with. So yeah, I mean, I think that the idea that this sort of presupposes a false empirical claim is pretty. I find that pretty implausible. But I want to say another thing about this, which is that even if I were to accept that it does presuppose a false empirical claim, so let's say that when I introduce the term Wulture into the language, that does indeed presuppose that there are no white vultures. So what? I mean, so what, right? We can still use the word. The underlying assumption must be that if a word makes false empirical presuppositions, then true claims can't be made using the word, or something like that. But I don't think that's right. So consider, for instance, colour language. There's a plausible argument that colour terms, colour language, rests on a false empirical claim. So I'm not saying I endorse this argument, but it's an argument that I think we should take seriously. So the argument would be something like, colour concepts are sort of presuppose that colour is an intrinsic property of the surfaces of objects. I mean, this is an argument that a lot of philosophers have made. But of course, the kind of intrinsic property that colour would have to be, well, there just is no property that meets those conditions. So it turns out that, really, I mean, so the inference is then sometimes made that, like, oh, well, really there are no colours. So when I say something like, the car is red, strictly speaking, that's false. But I think that further inference is very questionable. It's not obvious. Like, even if we grant that, okay, so colour terms presuppose that colours are intrinsic properties of the surfaces of objects, but there are no such properties. It's not obvious that prevents you from making true claims with colour terms. So when I say something like the car is red, right, maybe the sort of like truth conditions for that, maybe like the what's required in order for that to be true, maybe that doesn't, like, even if colour is, or let's put it this way, even if it's the case that our colour concepts are defective, right, it might be that what's required in order for that proposition to be true is something more sort of loose, right? Like maybe the fact that this claim is one that would be agreed upon by a wide enough range of people. Maybe the fact that it's the sort of claim that allows us to kind of smoothly interact with each other. You can take this sort of more kind of pragmatic line on what's required in order for the proposition to be true. So similarly then, to go back to the term Wulture, let's say that the term Wulture does indeed presuppose some false empirical claim. Well, when I say Ron is a Wulture, I like, it seems like, okay, well, the term still straightforwardly applies to Ron, right? Ron is a black vulture, and so yeah, this term contains this false empirical presupposition. Still, the term straightforwardly applies to him. On the other hand, if I say, like, this white hat is a Wulture, well, that's straightforwardly false. And when I say Delia is a Wulture, well, that's going to come out as both true and false, given the rules for the use of this term. What we would need, I think, to block the Wulture argument is the additional claim that if a term contains false presuppositions, it doesn't correctly apply to anything, or something along those lines. I suppose one thing you might try is just to say, well, Wulture assumes that there are no white vultures, so it can't correctly apply to white vultures, and so it can't correctly apply to Delia. But actually, that's fine. Yeah, Wulture doesn't correctly apply to Delia, right? It's just that it also does correctly apply to her. We can agree with that. Yes, of course, it can't correctly apply to white vultures, but it's also that it does correctly apply to them. That's exactly what you would say if you wanted to adopt this term into your language in order to get true contradictions. Okay then, so anyway, I think that's probably enough of that. As I said, that doesn't answer all of the objections, but maybe it goes through at least a couple of them. I will leave it there and say bye for now.